Late January 1972, the jungles of Guam. The rain falls not in drops, but in a constant, heavy mist. It beads on the broad, waxy leaves of the talisay trees, soaking the deep, loamy earth. The air is thick, humid, heavy, with the scent of decay and damp vegetation. The jungle is a cathedral of green light, filtering through the dense canopy in shattered, golden shafts. In this perpetual twilight, a man moves with a silence born of decades of practice. His name is Shoichi Yaka. His Imperial Japanese Army uniform, once a symbol of pride, is now a collection of tattered rags, meticulously repaired with fibers stripped from jungle plants. His skin is leathery, etched with the deep lines of hunger and sun. His eyes, deep-set and wary, scan the surroundings, missing nothing. He is hunting a small freshwater shrimp, perhaps in the clear stream, or setting a delicate snare for a fruit bat. His movements are economical, precise. He is a ghost in his own private empire, an empire of one. His hand instinctively moves to a small bamboo cylinder hanging from a cord around his neck, tucked safely beneath his tunic. Inside, carefully rolled, is not a military order or a map. It is a leaflet, faded, fragile, its paper softened by years of sweat and fear. On one side, Japanese characters, a safe conduct pass, a promise from the enemy. On the other, a message from the emperor himself, an order to cease resistance. For 28 years, this piece of paper has been his most profound secret, not a promise of salvation, but a shield against a far more terrifying enemy than the Americans ever were: the shame of his own thoughts, the seductive, treasonous whisper of the desire to live. He touches the cylinder, a silent ritual, a reminder of the impossible choice that has haunted him for 6,000 nights. The jungle holds its breath. This hidden world, this private war, was born from a far greater conflict, a conflict that forged soldiers like Yaka in a furnace of absolute belief and unthinking obedience. To understand his 28-year solitude, we must first journey back to the creation of the Imperial Japanese soldier. The Japan into which Shoichi Yaka was born, and the army he was conscripted into, was a nation possessed by a singular, divine mission: the rise of militaristic ultranationalism. In the 1930s, had fused Shinto mythology with state ideology, creating a powerful and dangerous dogma. At its center was the Emperor Hirohito, not merely a political leader, but a living god, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. To serve him was not a duty, it was a sacred, religious calling. This spiritual fervor was codified into military law with the Senjinkan, the field service code issued in 1941 by General Hideki. This was not a standard field manual, it was a scripture of death before dishonor. Its most infamous passage was unequivocal: do not suffer the shame of being captured alive. Die and leave no blame to your posthumous name. The concept of surrender was rendered obsolete. It was not an option to be considered. It was a moral and spiritual failure of the highest order. A soldier who allowed himself to be captured brought eternal shame upon himself, his family, his regiment, and the emperor. This indoctrination began in basic training, a brutal process designed to break down the individual and rebuild him as a single, expendable component of the imperial will. Physical punishment was relentless. Individuality was crushed. The rifle was not a tool, it was an extension of the soldier's soul, and to surrender it was to surrender a part of that soul. This created a soldier who viewed the battlefield through a lens utterly alien to his Western counterparts. For the American GI, fight to the death last stands were moments of extreme heroism. For the Japanese soldier, they were the default, the only acceptable conclusion to any engagement where victory was impossible. This mindset would produce the suicidal banzai charges of Attu and the relentless defenses of Tarawa. It would also plant the seeds for the phenomenon of the Zanryu Nipponhei, the stragglers, the holdouts, the soldiers who, cut off from their units, would simply continue their war indefinitely, unable to comprehend the concept of surrender. When Yaka was conscripted in 1941, he was a tailor by trade, a quiet man from a rural village. He was immersed in this ideology, absorbed it, and became a part of it. He was assigned to the 38th Regiment, and in March 1944, found himself on Guam Amia. Jima, the Great Shrine Island, a crucial link in Japan's inner defense perimeter. He was a simple soldier, a cog in a vast, divine machine. He believed what he was taught, that the Americans were barbarians, demons, who tortured and executed their prisoners. Surrender was not just shameful, it was a death sentence, and a dishonorable one at that. But a new kind of weapon was being prepared for men like Yak, a weapon designed not to destroy the body, but to shatter the mind. This psychological war would be waged not with bullets, but with paper and ink. The Americans had studied their enemy, and they were preparing to exploit the one tiny crack in the Imperial Japanese Army's psychological armor, the unthinkable power. Direct order. By the summer of 1944, the American island-hopping campaign was a scythe-cutting. Across the Pacific, the strategic genius of Admiral Nimitz and the relentless industrial might of the United States had turned the tide irrevocably. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were the next targets. Their capture would place American long-range B-29 bombers within striking distance of the Japanese home islands, a threat that the Imperial High Command understood with chilling clarity. The battle for Guam began on July 21, 1944. It was a brutal 19-day affair. Waves of Amtraks carrying the 3rd Marine Division and the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade crashed onto the beaches of Asan and Agat. They were met by a storm of artillery and machine gun fire from the seasoned Japanese defenders dug into the high ground. The fighting was close quarters and savage, in dense jungles and jagged limestone ridges. The Japanese, true to their doctrine, fought with a ferocity that bordered on the fanatical. Banzai charges were launched, not as tactical maneuvers, but as acts of spiritual purification, a final, glorious death for the emperor. But the Americans had learned from the blood-soaked lessons of Tarawa and Saipan. Their superiority in naval gunfire, air support, and flamethrower tanks was overwhelming. They systematically burned and blasted the defenders out of their fortified positions. By August 10, organized Japanese resistance on Guam was declared over. The island was officially secure. Yet for thousands of Japanese soldiers like Shoichi Yak, the war was not over. His 38th Regiment had been shattered, its command structure decapitated, along with a small group of perhaps 9 or 10 other soldiers. Yaku fled into the island's vast, uncharted interior. They believed this was a temporary retreat. They would hide, regroup, and conduct guerrilla warfare until the Imperial Navy returned to reclaim the island. It was a delusion, but a necessary one for survival. It was in this context that the American Psychological Warfare Units went to work. The U.S. Office of War Information, WWII, had become adept at crafting messages tailored to break the enemy's will. They understood the Japanese soldier's psyche, his devotion to the emperor, his fear of dishonor, and his belief in American brutality. Their masterstroke was the surrender leaflet, but this was no simple give-up flyer. The most effective version was a work of psychological genius. On one side, it was designed to look like an official military document, printed in crisp, formal Japanese. It was a safe conduct pass. It bore the signature of the Supreme Commander himself, General Douglas MacArthur. It guaranteed the bearer humane treatment, medical care, food, and a swift repatriation to Japan after the war. It was a tangible promise, an official-looking token that could be physically possessed. The reverse side was even more cunning. It featured a message purported to be from the Japanese government. It explained that the war situation was dire, that the military leadership had made mistakes, and that the emperor himself desired the preservation of his loyal subjects' lives. It was a direct, authoritative-sounding order to cease resistance. For a soldier indoctrinated to obey without question, this created a catastrophic cognitive dissonance. What was his duty? To die for the emperor as his military code demanded, or to surrender for the emperor as this document, which seemed to carry his will, commanded? Millions of these leaflets were dropped over the jungles of Guam. They fluttered down through the canopy like strange metallic leaves. Yak and soldiers like him would have seen them, they would have read them, and in that moment, a seed of an impossible dilemma was planted. To pick one up was an act of treason, to read it was a heresy, but To carry it, that was a secret so dangerous, it could only be held in the trembling hand of a man utterly alone. For Yaka, this leaflet became a private totem, not a ticket to surrender, but a psychological life raft. It was evidence that the world outside his jungle was more complex than he had been led to believe. It was a shield against the absolute finality of his own code. He carefully rolled it up, sealed it in a bamboo tube, and hung it around his neck. It rested against his skin, a constant, physical reminder of a choice he could not yet bring himself to make. He would carry this secret and this burden as the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. The world moved on, but in the jungles of Guam, a handful of men remained, trapped in a war that had long since ended, their fates suspended by a piece of paper. For Shoichi Yake, the jungle was not just a hiding place, it was a prison of his own mind. Each sunrise presented the same existential crisis. His training, the Senjinkan, was one. Master, it demanded loyalty unto death. It whispered that honor was a currency more valuable than life itself. It promised a legacy of purity, a name unblemished if he simply had the courage to die. But his own will to live was another master. It was a quieter, more persistent voice. It spoke in the gnawing pangs of hunger, in the primal fear of the dark, in the simple human desire to see another day. This voice found its tangible form in the leaflet tucked inside the bamboo tube. The leaflet was not merely a piece of propaganda. It was the physical manifestation of a schism in his soul. To look at it was to confront heresy. To believe it was to betray everything he had been taught to hold sacred, yet he could not destroy it. Its very existence offered a loophole in the rigid dogma of his fate. It suggested that the emperor, in his infinite wisdom, might actually want him to live. It proposed that the Americans might not be the monstrous torturers of imperial propaganda. This created a state of perpetual, low-grade psychological torment he was performing. The daily rituals of survival, weaving traps, digging his underground shelter, foraging for roots, all while carrying a secret that invalidated the very reason for that survival. He was preserving a life that his code demanded he sacrifice. The leaflet became a sacred object of a personal, clandestine religion. It was his private god of hope, worshipped direct opposition to the public god of duty. He was not waiting for a rescue that would never come. He was waiting for his own courage to either embrace the leaflet's promise or finally reject it. That courage would not come for 28 years. In the vast arsenal of the United States during World War II, from the M1 Garand to the atomic bomb, the surrender leaflet was one of the most cost-effective weapons ever deployed. This was the dawn of modern psychological operations, where the battlefield was not a piece of terrain, but the enemy soldier's consciousness. The leaflet dropped on Guam was a product of meticulous research and cultural analysis. By the WWII, it was engineered to bypass the soldier's military conditioning and appeal to more fundamental human instincts, the desire for safety, the trust in authority, and the longing for home. Its design was deliberate. The use of high-quality paper and formal Japanese script lent it an air of official legitimacy. It was not a crudely printed plea, it was a document. The inclusion of General MacArthur's signature was crucial. To a Japanese soldier, a high-ranking commander was a figure of immense authority. A promise from such a figure carried weight, countering the propaganda that American officers were undisciplined barbarians. But the true genius was the message on the reverse, by framing it as a communication from the Japanese government and invoking the emperor's will. The leaflet created a devastating paradox. It weaponized the soldier's own loyalty. If the emperor wanted him to live, then dying was an act of disobedience. This single sheet of paper sought to turn the Imperial Japanese Army's greatest strength, its unyielding devotion, into its most critical weakness. For every 1,000 leaflets that were ignored or torn up, one would find its way into the hands of a man like Yaka. It would not lead to immediate surrender, but it would plant a seed of doubt. It would fester. It would create a cognitive dissonance that the rigid imperial ideology had no tools to resolve. In Yakai's case, the technology did not achieve its immediate tactical goal, but it achieved a profound strategic one. It kept a flicker of humanity alive in a place designed to extinguish it. It was a life preserver. Thrown into a sea of dogma, and one man against all odds held on. This internal and external conflict defined Yako's existence, but his solitary struggle was just one facet of a much larger, more complex story. To fully grasp the weight of his decision, we must also examine the moral landscape he navigated and view his hidden war from the other side. In the stark binary of the Senjinkan, Yako's existence was a moral failure. He was alive when he should have been dead. Every breath was an act of disobedience. Yet in the jungle he had created his own ethical framework, a personal code of survival that existed in the gray space between the black and white dictates of his military upbringings. His decision to preserve the leaflet was the cornerstone of this private morality. It was his proof to himself that he was not a coward merely clinging to life. It was evidence that he was considering a higher, more complex duty. If the emperor truly willed it, then his surrender could be framed not as a failure, but as the ultimate act of obedience. This philosophical sleight of hand was his only defense against the crushing weight of shame. His daily life was a ritual of atonement. He was not living in ease, he was enduring a perpetual penance, the constant hunger, the fear of discovery, the backbreaking labor of survival. These were not just hardships. In his mind, they were a form of continuous service. By surviving under such brutal conditions, he was still proving his toughness, his endurance, his value as a soldier. He was, in a twisted way, still fighting his war. The leaflet allowed him to interpret this struggle not as a delay of his honorable death, but as a different kind of mission, to survive until the moment he could legitimately fulfill this new potential order from his emperor. This moral balancing act was incredibly fragile. It relied on a state of perpetual limbo. To actually use the leaflet would shatter the delicate fiction he had built. It would force a final, irreversible verdict on his life. Was he a loyal subject following a newly discovered divine command, or was he simply a man who had chosen life over honor? As long as the leaflet remained unused, tucked away in its bamboo tube, the question remained unanswered, and his personal war, both physical and moral, could continue. For the American forces who secured Guam in 1944 and the subsequent civilian administration, the remaining Japanese holdouts were a rapidly fading memory, then a nuisance, and finally a near myth. The war had moved on to Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, then ended in the blinding flash over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The guns fell silent, the world rebuilt. But on Guam, strange stories persisted. A farmer's fruit would go missing, a fishing net would be disturbed, a footprint would be found where none should be. To the local Chamorro people, the jungle was now haunted by the Tautamono and the Antigu, spirits of the ancient past, and among them new spirits had appeared, the Nippon, the ghost soldiers. For the American military, these holdouts were a logistical and psychological anomaly. The war was over, they had won, yet here in this small corner of their victory, a handful of enemy soldiers refused to acknowledge reality. They were no longer a tactical threat, but they were a disturbing presence. They were living relics of a fanaticism that was supposed to have died with the surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Occasional patrols would be sent into the jungle after reports of sightings. They would find abandoned camps, cleverly hidden cave shelters, or handmade tools, but they rarely found the men themselves. These soldiers had become phantoms, masters of their environment. The Americans, for the most part, came to see them not as soldiers, but as victims of a brutal ideology that had brainwashed them so completely they could not comprehend peace. The surrender leaflets had been a weapon of war. Now, their continued existence was a tragic postscript, a reminder that some wounds of the psyche were too deep to heal. The enemy was no longer the Imperial Japanese Army. The enemy was the past itself, and it was hiding in the green, impenetrable heart of the island. For Yako, the Americans were an abstract terror, the demons from the leaflets who might still torture him. For the Americans, Yak was a ghost story. This profound disconnect, this chasm of misunderstanding and time, is what made his eventual discovery not just a news event, but a collision of two separate realities. This state of suspended animation, this Cold War of one, could not last forever. The Jungle itself would eventually become an accomplice to the outside world, setting the stage for a collision between the present and the past. January 24, 1972, the Talifofo River. The jungle was a provider. For 28 years, it had given Shoichi Yak everything. He needed to sustain his private war: food, water, shelter, and most importantly, isolation, but on this day, it would betray him. The river was his lifeline. It was where he set his shrimp traps, woven from wild reeds. It was where he bathed under the cloak of darkness. It was a place of routine, of ingrained silent habit. On this evening, as the light began to fade, he was there, checking his traps. Two local fishermen, Jesus Dunas and Manuel de Gracia, were also at the river. They knew the old stories, the tales of the Japanese ghost soldiers. Most dismissed them as legends, campfire tales to scare children, but they also knew the jungle. They knew how to read its signs: a broken branch, a misplaced stone, the subtle silence that indicated hidden presence. And on this evening, they saw him. A figure thin and spectral, moving with an unnatural quiet through the dense foliage. Near the riverbank, he was not a spirit. He was a man dressed in tattered homemade clothes, his hair long and matted, his body weathered by decades of sun and rain. The illusion of his hidden empire shattered in an instant. The 2 decades of meticulous caution evaporated. He was seen. A frantic chase ensued. It was not a chase of youth and vigor, but one of desperation. Against determined curiosity, Yako, though weakened by age and a diet of nuts, mangoes and the occasional small animal, was fueled by a lifetime of fear. He scrambled through the undergrowth, his heart hammering against the bamboo cylinder. On his chest, Dunas and de Gracia, stronger and well-fed, pursued him relentlessly. They were not trying to capture a soldier, they were trying to confirm a myth. They cornered him near the riverbank. There was a struggle, brief and clumsy. Yak, the ghost, was made flesh. He was real, he was terrified, and he was utterly, undeniably captured. The 2 fishermen, now understanding the immense historical weight of their discovery, did not harm him. They spoke to him in calming tones, securing him and leading him out of the jungle that had been his home, his fortress, and his prison for more than half his life. The journey out of the green gloom was a blur. For Yakai, it was not a liberation, but a final, crushing defeat. He had been found. The shame he had carried for 28 years was now about to be made public. His mind raced with the indoctrinated scripts of his youth. He had failed. He had suffered the ultimate disgrace of being captured alive. As they emerged from the tree line, the world he had left in 1944 rushed in to meet him. The sights, the sounds, the smells of a modernizing Guam were a sensory assault. The war for everyone else was a distant memory. For him, it had just ended. The moment of capture was a physical end, but the true psychological turning point was yet to come. He was now faced with the reality of the world he had feared for so long, and the staggering truth of the leaflet he had carried for all those years. The first stop was the local police station, then a hospital. The news spread with the speed of lightning. Japanese soldier found alive on Guam. The wire services picked it up, and the story became a global sensation. A living relic from the most destructive war in history had just been unearthed. For Yak, these first hours were a waking nightmare. He was poked, prodded, and examined by doctors who spoke a language he didn't understand. Cameras flashed in his face. He expected brutality, interrogation, execution. Instead, he was given a clone hospital gown, a warm meal, his first proper food in decades, and treated with a kindness that utterly dismantled the propaganda he had carried for 28 years. The Americans were not demons. They were doctors and policemen looking at him not with hatred but with a mixture of pity and awe. But the most profound shock was yet to come. Through a Japanese interpreter who was hastily flown in, the reality of his situation was laid bare. The war had ended in August 1945. Japan had surrendered. The emperor had renounced his divinity. Japan was not a smoldering ruin but a thriving, peaceful nation. The imperial army he had served no longer existed. This information was a psychological earthquake. Every foundational pillar of his existence, his purpose, his duty, his very identity, crumbled to dust in an instant. His Entire adult life, his struggle for survival had been based on a premise that was false. He had not been a soldier holding out for the emperor's return. He had been a man hiding from a war that was long over. The leaflet he had carried, the promise he had secretly harbored, had been true all along. The moment was captured on film and would become one of the most iconic images of the post-war era. Yaku, his face a mask of bewilderment and profound sorrow, listening to the interpreter. He did not cheer or celebrate. He bowed his head low and in a voice thick with emotion, uttered the words that would define his legacy. It is with much embarrassment that I have returned alive. This was not the statement of a man happy to be saved. It was the anguished cry. Soldier who believed to his very core that he had failed. His shame was not for the crimes he had committed, but for the simple human act of surviving. He was returning to a Japan he no longer knew, carrying the weight of a duty that had become obsolete. Generation ago, his war was finally, truly over, and he had lost the only thing he had left: his reason for fighting it. His return to Japan on February 2, 1972, was a national event of unprecedented scale. He was met by a crowd of thousands, a media circus, and a nation grappling with a complex mix of emotions: curiosity, pity, and a deep, collective introspection about the price of their vanished empire. He was a time traveler, a living monument to a past that modern Japan had worked hard to forget. The initial shock of his return would ripple outwards, creating waves that touched every aspect of Japanese society and forced a final, painful reckoning with the ghosts of the war. The solitary struggle of one man was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. The return of Shoichi Yaku to Japan on February 2, 1972, was not merely a news story. It was a national catharsis. He landed at Haneda Airport to a media scrum of over 2,000 reporters and photographers. The entire nation watched, transfixed, as this frail, anachronistic figure, dressed in a suit that hung loosely on his malnourished frame, stepped hesitantly onto the tarmac. He was greeted not as a disgraced soldier, but as a celebrity, a folk hero, and a profound psychological puzzle. The Japanese public's reaction was a complex tapestry of emotions. There was overwhelming curiosity for a generation that had grown up in the peace and prosperity of the post-war economic miracle. Yaku was a living link to a distant, almost mythological past. He was a real-life Robinson Crusoe, a figure of incredible endurance. But there was also a deep, unsettling sense of collective guilt and introspection. His famous words, "It is with much embarrassment that I have returned alive," echoed across the nation. They were a stark, uncomfortable reminder of the Senjinkan Code that had driven so many to their deaths and had psychologically imprisoned this one man for decades after the fact. He was a walking indictment of the imperial system's most extreme indoctrination. His story forced a public conversation that many had been avoiding. What had that ideology truly cost? The government, sensitive to this, treated him with immense respect. He was given a hero's welcome, a full military pension, and a significant sum of money from the media for the rights to his story. He received over 6,000 letters from the public, many from former soldiers expressing their own long-buried shame and gratitude for his survival. For Yaku himself, the immediate aftermath was a disorienting whirlwind. He underwent extensive medical and psychological evaluations. Doctors were astonished by his relatively good health, attributing it to his diet of nuts, fish, and frogs, and his active lifestyle. Psychologists noted his sharp mind and gentle demeanor, but also the deep-seated trauma of his isolation. He was bewildered by the Japan he saw: the skyscrapers, the bullet trains, the televisions, the consumerism. The rural village he remembered was gone, replaced by a bustling, modern nation. His parents had passed away, believing him dead. His fiancée had married another man. The world he had fought for and hidden for no longer existed. Yaku's personal adjustment was a monumental task, but his story also had a broader, more profound impact. It reopened a chapter of the war that Japan had tried to close, triggering a final, poignant search for other lost soldiers and forcing a lasting reflection on the nature of duty and the resilience of the human spirit. Shoichi Yakai's reappearance did more than just captivate the public, it had tangible historical consequences. The most immediate was the reinvigoration of the search for other Japanese holdouts or Zanryu Nipponhei, the Japanese government, spurred by the media frenzy and public sentiment, launched formal investigations and expanded its efforts across the former battlefields of the Pacific. Yakai's story proved that it was possible. This led, just over 2 years later, to an even more dramatic discovery. In 1974, Lieutenant Hiro Onoda was found on the Philippine island of Lubang, having held out for 29 years, refusing to believe the war was over until his former commanding officer was flown in to personally relieve him of his duties. Onoda's story, in many ways even more militant than Yakai's, overshadowed his, but also reinforced the same painful lesson about the power of indoctrination. Then, in 1975, the final confirmed holdout, Teruo Nakamura, was discovered on the Indonesian island of Morotai. Yakai had been the first, the crack in the dam that led to the final accounting of the Imperial Japanese Army's lost soldiers. For Yak personally, life after the jungle was a study in quiet adaptation. He became a reluctant public figure, a living symbol of endurance. He wrote a best-selling autobiography, married within a year of his return, and became a popular television personality, often speaking about survival skills and his unique experience. He was, in a sense, Japan's most famous survivalist, yet the psychological imprint of his 28-year solitude never faded. He was known for his frugality, his deep respect for resources, and a quiet, almost detached demeanor. He had returned to society, but part of him would always remain in that jungle, a ghost alongside the man. His legacy is a complex one. He is not remembered as a warrior, but as a survivor. His story is not one of military glory, but of a very human, very private struggle against an invisible enemy, his own conditioning. He became a symbol of the ultimate cost of war, a cost that extends far beyond the battlefield and long after the last shot is fired. He was a living bridge between the militaristic Japan of the 1940s and the pacifist, economic powerhouse of the 1970s. His embarrassment upon return was a purer expression of the old code than any banzai charge. His subsequent life in peace became a quiet testament to the possibility of change. He passed away in 1997 of a heart attack at the age of 82. In his later years, he expressed a wish to return to Guam, not as a soldier but as a visitor. He wanted to see the jungle that had been his home, his prison, and his sanctuary. He never made the trip. The jungle and the war had defined him completely. His story remains one of the 20th century's most poignant parables, a testament to the fact that the longest wars are often the ones fought within the human mind. The guns fell silent in 1945, but for Shoichi Yakai, the true peace would take nearly 3 more decades to arrive. His story, now complete, invites a final, calm meditation on its deeper meaning for history, for warfare, and for the definition of the human spirit itself. Shall I write the reflection now? The story of Shoichi Yakai is not one of battle maps and grand strategy. It is an archaeological dig into the human soul under absolute pressure. His 28-year solitude stands as one of history's most profound and unintended experiments on the limits of the human spirit. He was a man who was trained to die for a concept, but who ultimately found he was built to live for the simple, undeniable fact of existence itself. His legacy challenges our very definitions of duty and honor. The Senjinkan Code demanded a spectacular, fiery end, a death that served as a final, public statement of loyalty. Yakai's survival was the antithesis of this. It was quiet, private, and undramatic. It was an honor not of the group, but of the individual. It was the honor of the weaver, the trapper, the digger, the honor of a man who, when stripped of everything, found that his most fundamental duty was not to an emperor, but to the next breath, the next sunrise. The surrender leaflet he carried was more than a promise of safety. It was a key, not key to a prison cell, but to the prison of his own mind. It represented a crack in the monolith of ideology through which a sliver of individual thought could finally enter. He never used it as a ticket to freedom, but he used it as a shield against absolute despair. It was his permission slip to consider hope, a emotion his training had tried to eradicate. In the end, Yakai's war was not against the Americans, nor the jungle, nor even time. Itself, it was a war against an idea, the idea that a man's life is only as valuable as his. Willingness to sacrifice it for the state, his ultimate victory was not in his return to Japan, but in the quiet, stubborn persistence of his humanity through decades of isolation. He emerged not as a soldier, but as a man, a living reminder that while empires rise and fall and ideologies wax and wane, the will to endure, to see tomorrow, is the most ancient and most human force of all. His story ends not with a bang, but with the soft, rustling whisper of a leaflet carefully preserved, a testament to the fragile, unbreakable shield of hope.